Okay, right. Let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into, well, a really monumental work by Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies.
Mm,
And this isn't just, a dry philosophy book. It's this vigorous two-volume critique that really spans history, political thought.
absolutely. It came out of World War II, didn't it? 1945.
Exactly. And our mission really is to pull out the key insights and explore how deeply this stuff connects to, well, the world you're living in right now.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is Popper called it his war work. He wasn't just looking at the totalitarian regimes of his day, fascism, communism,
He went further back.
way back. He meticulously traced the intellectual roots back thousands of years to ancient Greece, believe it or not.
And that's what's so compelling, I think. Our sources really highlight his fierce attack on what he termed historicism.
Right, historicism.
He saw this dangerous habit of historical prophecy as just a repellent obstacle to democracy, to reason.
Well, yeah.
Volume 1 tears into Plato. Volume 2 takes on Hegel and Marx.
And it really resonated, didn't it? Became a symbol of hope for dissidents.
Especially when communism collapsed in the early 90s. That Russian translation in 92 must have been huge.
A bestseller, yeah.
So let's start there. This core idea, historicism. It sounds a bit abstract, maybe, but Popper clearly thought it was profoundly dangerous. What exactly is it? Why the threat?
Well, fundamentally, historicism is this belief that history unfolds according to certain knowable laws, predetermined laws, really.
Okay.
Which means if you buy into that, you think you can predict the future course of history.
Right, like a science of history.
Kind of, yeah. But Popper saw this as just a dangerous illusion. He argued it invariably leads towards totalitarian thinking.
Why invariably?
Because if you believe history's inevitable destination is final goal, well, then any means to get there can start to seem justified, whether it's coming from the right or the left, politically speaking.
Okay, that makes sense. And this is where it gets really wild, because he traces this way, way back.
To ancient Greece, yeah. He sees historicism showing up in things like racialism, the chosen race idea, a natural law of racial struggle.
And then similarly with Marx.
Exactly. The chosen class, the economic law of class struggle. And he connects both of these modern ideas back to Hegel,
Who in turn drew from.
earlier thinkers,
Yeah.
Heraclitus, and especially Plato.
Okay, Heraclitus first then. What was his contribution to this problematic lineage?
Well, Heraclitus believed in universal flux, everything's constantly changing. But he also famously said, strife or war is the father and the king of all things.
Okay, war as the driving force.
And crucially, he saw the outcome of war as always just, which is a core historicist idea, right?
Yeah.
That what happens is what is right, or what history intended.
So confusing what is with what ought to be.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That lack of distinction between human norms, the rules we decide on, and natural laws, the way things just are. Popper called that tribal tabooism. It's like going back to a closed society where the rules are sacred, fixed, unquestionable.
Got it. So Heraclitus gives us this flux, this justification of conflict. But then Plato, he's often seen as this foundational figure. How does Popper argue he took these ideas towards totalitarianism?
Popper's critique of Plato is pretty intense. He argues Plato was deeply disturbed by the changes happening in Athens, the move towards democracy and individualism. He saw it as decay.
So he wanted stability.
More than that, he wanted to arrest all change, completely stop it. His ideal state, laid out in the Republic, was basically modeled on these ancient, rigid tribal systems like Sparta.
Like freezing society in time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The whole goal was to eliminate disagreement, eliminate disunion through these fixed, unchangeable class divisions.
That's a pretty stark picture. But Plato is so revered. Does Popper just dismiss him, or does he acknowledge any value?
Oh, he acknowledges Plato's intent. He sees a kind of fundamental benevolence there. Plato genuinely saw people suffering from what Popper calls the strain of civilization, the stress of individual responsibility that comes with democracy.
So the diagnosis was maybe insightful.
The diagnosis of the unease, perhaps. But Popper insists Plato's proposed cure, his medico-political treatment, which was basically returning to tribalism and stopping change. It was hopelessly wrong. And totalitarian.
And his idea of justice was tied into that.
Completely. For Plato in the Republic, justice wasn't about fairness or equality as we might think of it. It meant that which is in the interest of the best state. Which meant keeping those rigid class divisions stable and stopping change. It was a direct attack on the more equalitarian ideas of justice emerging at the time.
And he had some, pretty specific mechanisms for this. You mentioned the classes. What about the lordly lie?
Ah, yes. That's quite chilling. So first, he advocated for this communism of the ruling caste. For the guardians, the rulers and soldiers, there was to be common property of wives, of children, and of all chattels.
Eradicating the private sphere for them.
Totally. Everything private and individual wiped out to ensure unity. And then, to justify the class system itself, he introduced the lordly lie, or the myth of racialism.
Which was
The story that God put different metals into people. Gold into the rulers, silver into the auxiliaries or soldiers, and iron and copper into the workers and farmers. And crucially, these metals were hereditary.
wow. So a manufactured justification for inherent inequality.
Exactly. And Plato was explicit. He said rulers should use lies and deception for the perfection of the herd, as he put it. The noble lie, used for the supposed greater good. It's a core totalitarian tactic, isn't it?
It really is. Okay, so we've seen Popper trace these ideas back through Plato's desire for this static, controlled society, even advocating deception. Now let's jump forward. How did Hegel and Marx build on this foundation? How did Hegel get us towards state worship?
Well, Hegel takes it to another level. His philosophy involves this almost, well, spiritual adoration of the state. He actually declared the state is the divine idea as it exists on earth.
The divine idea.
We must therefore worship the state as the manifestation of the divine on earth. For Hegel, the individual, basically nothing. You know everything your whole existence to the state.
So the state becomes almost a god, and his dialectics play into this, that thesis, antithesis, synthesis idea.
Right. History isn't random for Hegel. It progresses through this conflict of ideas. Thesis meets antithesis. They clash and merge into a higher synthesis. And guess what the highest point of history was for Hegel?
Let me guess. Prussia.
The absolute monarchy of Prussia. His philosophy essentially baked in the idea that what is good because it's the current culmination of history. And therefore, might is right.
That's a dangerous path.
And he even twists the meaning of liberty. He argued every genuine law is a liberty, implying
The more laws, the more free you are.
exactly, which is a complete flip from someone like Kant, who saw freedom requiring limits only to ensure everyone else has the same freedom. For Hegel, real freedom was obedience to the rational state.
Okay, so that's Hegel. Now Marx. Popper called this book his war work, partly because he was critiquing Marxism. How does Marx fit the historicist mold?
Well, Marx, interestingly, was dead set against what he called psychologism. He rejected the idea that social laws boil down to just human nature.
Right, he focused on material conditions.
Precisely. His famous line, "It is not the consciousness of man that determines his existence, rather it is his social existence that determines his consciousness. Our ideas come from our economic reality."
So he flipped Hegel's idealism on its head?
He saw himself as doing that, yeah, focusing on the material base.
Right.
But, and this is Popper's point, Marx's own theories still contain this incredibly powerful historicist prophecy.
The inevitable revolution.
The inevitable class struggle, the inevitable proletarian revolution. It's still a prediction about the unavoidable direction of history.
But didn't Marx soften that stance later on, suggesting peaceful change might be possible in some places, like England?
He did, yeah, which adds complexity. He suggests maybe in England or America, the revolution could happen peacefully, legally, but he still believed that if the ruling class fought back, violence would be necessary.
The historicist outcome was still paramount.
And this ties into what Popper calls Marx's historicist moral theory. The idea here is that the morality that's going to win out, the one that represents the future, that's the proletarian morality.
So you should adopt the morality of the future.
Yes, but not because you've decided it's ethically better through reasoned argument. You adopt it because history has supposedly decreed it will be the winning morality. It's a historical prediction disguised as a moral choice.
Which again kind of sidelines actual ethical reasoning. It's just about being on the right side of history.
Exactly. And you see echoes of that thinking today sometimes. It removes personal responsibility for the choice.
Yeah, that's a really sharp point. And it brings us to something critical Popper warned about, betrayal of the intellectuals. What did he mean by that?
He observed that intellectuals, people who think about the world as a whole, often feel this deep sense of responsibility, which is good, right?
Yeah, sure.
But then they can yield to the temptation to attempt grasping the world as a whole, explaining it entirely, and offering universal solutions to its problems. Grand theories.
Utopian blueprints.
Exactly. And when they do that, Popper says they can cause immense harm. He points out that some key figures behind, say, Nazi ideology or Marxism itself were brilliant intellectuals. But their all-encompassing predictive systems had devastating results.
So the road to a closed society can be paved by intellectuals with grand but ultimately flawed visions.
That's the warning. So what's the alternative then? If historicism and these grand series lead us astray, what does Popper advocate?
Right. What's the positive vision?
He champions the open society. And the key characteristic of an open society is what he calls critical dualism.
Critical dualism. Okay, what's that?
It's basically maintaining a very clear distinction between natural laws like gravity, things we discover about the world, and normative laws like thou shalt not kill, rules and norms that we create and are responsible for.
So separating is from ought.
Precisely. And admitting that the responsibility for our ethical decisions, for the norms we choose, is entirely ours. We can't shift it onto God or nature or society or, crucially, onto history.
Wow. That's a heavy dose of personal responsibility right there. No hiding behind destiny or inevitable forces.
Not at all. And he actually looks back to ancient Athens again to find pioneers of this thinking, to the great generation, he calls them, around the time of the Peloponnesian War.
People like Pericles.
Exactly. Pericles, championing equality before the law, political individualism. Protagoras, the sophist, who argued that human institutions are man-made, not divinely ordained, so we can change them, improve them.
And Socrates too, I assume.
Especially Socrates, teaching faith in human reason, critical thinking, questioning everything what Popper saw as the very spirit of science applied to ethics and society.
So these values we often associate with Western civilization, humanitarianism, freedom, equality, he traces them back there.
He sees the roots there, yeah, and argues they were later amplified, particularly by Christianity's emphasis on individual conscience and compassion.
Okay, so if the open society rejects these grand utopian plans, what Popper calls utopian social engineering, which he thinks is incredibly dangerous.
Right, because trying to remake society wholesale usually requires massive disruption and often violence.
What's the alternative method for improving things? He called it piecemeal social engineering, right? What does that actually look like?
It's much more modest. It's about searching for and fighting against the biggest, most urgent evils in society, rather than trying to achieve some abstract ultimate good.
So focusing on concrete problems.
Exactly. Think small, adaptable experiments. Maybe you identify a problem like, say, inadequate healthcare access in a region, instead of designing a perfect nationwide system from scratch.
You try something smaller first.
Maybe you introduce a specific reform, like a new type of health insurance option, or improve clinics in one area. You see how it works, learn from the mistakes, adjust it incrementally. Tax reforms, social insurance schemes, small steps, constantly monitored and adjusted.
It sounds like the scientific method, but for society. Trial and error.
That's very much the spirit. It's rooted in fallibilism, the core idea that we can be wrong, and that we learn primarily from discovering our mistakes.
So finding an error isn't failure, it's progress.
Exactly. Every time we find a flaw in a policy or an institution, that's an advance in our practical knowledge. Even a false theory, Popper argued, can contain elements of truth we learn from. It's about testing ideas against experience, publicly and repeatably.
And this ties into his idea of critical rationalism. How does that guide these piecemeal efforts?
Right. Critical rationalism is the underlying approach. It accepts, look, our most fundamental moral choices probably aren't based purely on logic. There's always an element of, well, non-rational commitment.
The leap of faith, almost.
A minimal concession to irrationalism, as he puts it. But critical rationalism insists we must still use reason and argument to rigorously examine the likely consequences of our choices and the alternatives.
So we understand what we're actually choosing, even if the ultimate value isn't logically provable.
Precisely. It allows us to make informed, non-blind decisions, comparing the potential outcomes of different norms or policies, even if the initial commitment has an irrational element.
And the danger of not doing that, of embracing pure rationalism.
Popper warns that leads very easily back towards tribalism, the irrational division of men into those who are near to us and those who are far from us versus them.
Even potentially racial doctrines.
Absolutely. It's a stark warning against mysticism, against attempts to rationalize the irrational by appealing to feelings, intuition, or supposed group destiny instead of open, critical debate and evidence.
Okay. So bringing this all together then, what's the big takeaway for you listening to this? Popper's Open Society isn't just some dusty old book.
Not at all.
It feels like a vital playbook, really, for navigating this constant tension we all feel between wanting certainty, wanting easy answers, and the actual demands of living in freedom.
It's that constant reminder that the responsibility for our ethical choices for the kind of society we build It can't be outsourced. Not to history, not to a leader, not to an ideology.
It's on us, individually and collectively.
Right. Which leads to a pretty important question, I think, connecting it all to the bigger picture today. In this world, just saturated with information, competing narratives, endless arguments online, how can you personally continuously cultivate that critical thinking, that individual responsibility, which Popper argues is just essential for keeping a society open?
And maybe related to that, how do we remember that the grand narratives, the history of the great and the powerful, as Popper puts it, might just be a shallow comedy? Compared to the real, often unrecorded human experience, the sum of individual choices and struggles that truly shape our world day by day?